serves as an advisor
Hello.
to the Chamber of Commerce. He's a board member of the Center for Public Secrets, an alternative arts and culture institution in Tulsa. And if you missed his riveting testimony before the House Judiciary Committee in Washington, D.C. this summer on justice for the victims of the massacre, you're in luck, because we will not only do a short segment of his remarks in one of our video segments, but we will also share the link to the full testimony today. Randy Hopkins was born in Tulsa and raised in Sand Springs, Oklahoma, a graduate of Oklahoma State and University of Texas Law School, a trial lawyer in Houston, Texas. He later moved to Oregon, where he now resides. A student of Tulsa history, his article, Birthday of the Klan, the Tulsa Outrage of 1970, published in the Chronicles of Oklahoma, from the annual Muriel Wright Award issued by the Oklahoma Historical Society in 2020 for outstanding article. He is also at work on a film documenting the investigation into mass graves of the massacre's victims that got underway this past summer, and we will also sample a bit of that research today. So we're going to, Chief Al-Massan will be our first discussant, and we're going to start that section of our discussion by, we're going to start with a little clip, and then I will be engaging with him in some dialogue. So here we go.
My name is Christy Williams, also known as Arisha B.E. This is Greenwood, 40 city blocks of businesses, residential homes, community, and you see this. This is what we have left. I don't know why the stairs are still here, but I will say that the stairs serve as a reminder to myself that there is work that needs to be done.
Today we're at Oakland Cemetery, the site of supposed mass graves. And at this point, I can no longer say supposed.
We've been wanting a mass grave investigation for a long time, for years, because of all the stories.
Sorry.
And when we find those remains, it is our hope that we give them burial in a suitable place. I personally would love for them to take Standpipe Hill and turn the whole hill into a memorial, so that we can honor the legacy of all those men and women who fought for Greenwood, who ran from Greenwood, who lived in Greenwood, who built in Greenwood, who created their vision and their dream in Greenwood.
They have to know that we have a strong community. We had an economy within an economy. We had a nation within a nation.
My grandfather had to run for his life and never look back. His aunt, his surrogate parents, which were my great aunt and my great uncle, they never came back to Oklahoma. They never came back to Tulsa. I am the descendant of those people who still want justice.
So, this powerful clip, Chief Al-Massan, I wonder if you would tell us who Christy Williams is, how you two came to know each other, and how your work got started.
So, Christy Williams is actually my cousin. Her great aunt, she was in the Dreamland Theater the night that the events took place in Greenwood, the massacre of Greenwood. She was on a date, wasn't supposed to be on a date. But that's how she ended up involved in the affair of 1921. And so we have been, I brought her into this this fight for justice. I was telling her, these are things we have to do to honor our ancestors. It's our responsibility. Like the baton of justice has been handed to us, whether it's historic justice, whether it's through the judicial system, whatever form it takes, whatever form you feel comfortable taking, we have a responsibility. And so that's how our relationship has been and continues to be to this day.
Wonderful. It's so rich, and we'll be hearing a little bit more from her later in our discussion. I wonder if we could take this even further back to how the story of the real Black Wall Street walking tour got started, and tell us that story. Where did the idea come from, and how did it unfold today?
That's funny. You're the first person to ever ask that question.
Like
and I've been in a ton of interviews. Yeah, that's the right question. You get a good story. So it's funny, actually. We knew that people were talking about Greenwood. A lot of people were telling the story of Greenwood, and we were hearing these narratives that we felt like, I got this habit. I have this attitude. I need a receipt. I like unimpeachable work, right? Like, if you tell me something, I need you to provide me with a receipt so I can confirm, because I don't want any clapback. And so that's kind of my
Hello.
We we said, hey, we're descendants. Why are we not telling our own story? It makes absolutely no sense. I'm even looking at all the authors who written books, and I'm just like, these people they either aren't from here, or this wasn't their experience, and I thought, who best to tell our story than us? And so that's how we began the Real Black Wall Street tour, and we put real on there intentionally because you don't want anything that's homogenized, condensed, watered down. We wanted you to have the real organic deal. And so that's how the tour comes.
Wonderful. And how did you start telling that story?
Well, I started telling it from the lens of those who survived it, right? Because, excuse me one minute, something in my eye. I wanted to tell it through the lens of those who experienced it, because I went to Jamaica one year in a place called Woodside. They have this thing called Black Space where they meet and speak about the state of our people and oppression, and try to how to get rid of it, or how to overcome some of the issues that we have. And one of the authors said, one of the elders in the community, because there were some academics there were grassroots people there. One of the oldest women in the community, she said, head come before book. And I was like, oh my. Like, she just said a mouthful. Like, head comes before book. Everybody who's writing books is regurgitating what the head said, right? And so I said, okay, so let me speak to the head. Let me speak from the perspective of the head. I want to tell this story so that people actually feel like I didn't just go on a tour of regurgitation. I actually got to experience what it's like to be in Greenwood, to smell the air, to understand, because you still have the train tracks nearby, so you can still smell the toxins from the trains, and then you can smell food nearby. You kind of get a taste of everything. And so I wanted people to be able to say, I didn't get that in a book. Why didn't I get it in a book? Because then you start to understand there's so much more to this story that's unwritten. There's so much more to how we understand such a phenomenal place. Like, we really don't give it any justice. Like, I don't even like to use the term Black Wall Street, honestly, because people think linear. They think north, south, east, and west, right? And you're not talking about a street. You're talking about an entire city within a city. And that's what that represented. And so that's how we really just, I was like, we got to tell this story. We got to tell it the right way. That's historic justice.
Wonderful. We're going to see a little clip of the tour as it is now. I think people are even in masks in the little clip we have. It's very recent. But can you, just before we get there, just particularly for our audience members who have imagined maybe doing something like this in their own practice, in their own communities, in their own neighborhoods, take us to that first walking tour.
Okay, the first one.
And who was there? Take us through, and then we'll move to the clip.
Okay, that's a good one. So the first one, actually, it was the first official tour through our website, everything. It was actually with 140 students. And it was, yeah, right, imagine that. High school student.
Quite a debut.
Yeah, it was. And but the beautiful thing is we were doing a soil collection ceremony that we do in conjunction with the Equal Justice Initiative that Brian Stevenson created out of Montgomery, Alabama. And so we got those students and we basically we said, okay, before we start this tour, we're going to do a ceremony. And we're going to go to this location where someone was lynched from the definition of lynching based on Brian Stevenson's definition, which is any form of violence or terror against a black person in certain time periods of history. So we did this soil collection. I have all these students there, and we're telling the story of how this man passed away. And students are leaning on each other. Some of them are crying. It's kind of cold, and everybody's kind of huddled up. And at that moment, we realized the impact, because we have white students, Hispanic students, black students, and they're all in this space together, seeing each other through a human lens, right? Like, we just did something really powerful here. Like, how can we expand on that? So then from there, we walk down Greenwood, and there are plaques on the ground that tell you where certain businesses were located before Greenwood was destroyed. And we take the students to those different sites and those different spaces, and we explain who owned that facility, what it was like for the people during that time, what happened to these people after the massacre. We give them a very full, holistic understanding about Greenwood and what it represented. And so the idea is, how can we bring the information in the books to life, right? That's really key. Bringing it to life. And that was the first tour was like. We brought something to life. We animated it. I even allowed some of the students to actually become figures in the story. Like, I need somebody to be Anita Hooker. She was Hispanic and African American, right? And so I had this girl. She came. She fit the identity. And then I had this guy who wanted to be her husband. And they were excited. Like, this is cool. Like, we can act out history in a way that makes us feel really connected to the story. So that's what
herd immunity possible in December? What?
Transformational space. It's amazing. We're going to pause and take a little peek. We're going to follow you
In Oregon or where?
Okay.
And I want to
Let me see.
Then we'll have a little bit more question. Another question for you to follow up. So,
Oregon. Herd immunity
so hopefully this will be a little more cooperative. So here we go.
against Delta in late December could reach. That would be a good thing. 8. I have to go back so I can. Where did the Zoom go? When they show something on the main screen, you can't hear it if you're not on the main screen.
To expose the extent of the massacre and its cover-up for decades.
Only 40% of the original inhabitants rebuilt Greenwood. 60% never came back. Where are they buried? What river they dumped in? What mass grave were they put in? And it was all homes and businesses. All the way that way, all the way that way. This is the Cotton Club. All of the bands who made the Cotton Club famous in New York City came to Tulsa first. That same sheriff who had Dick rolling in the courthouse building, that's him in the left corner next to that horse. Overnight, between midnight and 5 a.m., they devised a plan, deputized hundreds of white men. Don't let anybody call it a mob. Because if you got a badge, you're sanctioned. That city's sanctioned murder. So we have to tell our own story so that people know the truth about what really happened in Greenwood.
This is going to make me proud and angry at the same time.
Absolutely. That's balance.
You give tours,
Yes.
in Greenwood.
Why? Napoleon Bonaparte said, and I'm paraphrasing, he said, history is a set of lies agreed upon. So I agree to tell my own story. I mean, like, where are we getting our information from? The same people who kept it a secret.
What is your biggest fear surrounding the narrative of what happened?
The last 3 living survivors would die without justice. That is literally my biggest fear. I've looked in their eyes just as I looked in my grandfather's eyes. And for them to look at you and tell you, Chief, don't let them forget us. Them to say don't let people forget us. What I heard was these people are trying to bury us while we live.
I am a 107-year-old and have never been seen justice. I pray that one day I will.
The 3 living survivors recently testified on Capitol Hill in front of a subcommittee on reparations.
This day I can barely afford my everyday needs. All the while the city of this Tulsa have unjustly used the names and stories of victims like me.
In 2001, an Oklahoma commission published the first government report on the massacre. Its main recommendation was reparations for descendants and survivors, but Tulsa failed to take action. Now survivors and descendants are suing the city to get them.
In just a few decades, my ancestors would experience enslavement, false freedom, Jim Crow, and a Holocaust that would be hidden from the pages of history for 100 years. This is not a matter of past trauma. It is current.
I would like to welcome you into this sacred space. We are honored to have our survivors, who you'll see in just a moment. Mother Fletcher and Uncle Red are in the building.
Survivors have been fighting since 1921. They filed at least 193 claims to recoup damages in the massacre. None were paid out. Just days after the massacre, a local paper stated another nigger town should never again exist in Tulsa, and possibly finding an urban renewal prevented them from rebuilding. As a result, people in North Tulsa, the majority black part of the city, suffer from poverty and arrest, have a lower life expectancy. G.T. Bynum's proposal addressing his city's racial inequities is economic development. He set aside $42 million tax loans to attract investment to Greenwood, but no black developers in the contracts. Direct reparations for the victims and their descendants. What plans do you have in place to engage that?
So I think when it comes to payments, the challenge there is what's the source? Where does it come from? Where the challenge is if it's coming from tax that's levied on everybody in Tulsa. When general carry out a crime, and I don't think that this generation of Tulsans should be financially penalized for something that criminals did 100 years ago. There's a lot of other things we're trying to do on that front, including economic revitalization and trying to rebuild Black Wall Street here.
When you say rebuild it, what does that look like?
We want to create an environment where business and property ownership and wealth creation can occur.
The development that are happening right now in Greenwood, are those black developers?
Whether it's the college campus or the baseball field or USADMX's Olympic Training and Trials facility that's under construction, the answer is no. But the value of those projects is that they create a draw into an area, and then that incentivizes the private sector redevelopment in the area.
I don't know. Wait a minute. Come on, Mayor.
Yeah.
Stay with me on this one. Stay with me on this one. It was their land. It was their businesses. I don't think a BMX track facility and a baseball stadium is going to do the trick.
No BMX arena or anything else that we can do today will make up for the tragedy that occurred in 1921. I mean, hundreds of our neighbors got murdered that night.
There seems to be a lot of proposals around economic development. For who?
I mean, for who? That's what you have to ask. And when you walk in deep Greenwood, you see all kind of stuff being built around Greenwood, but all of the tax revenue is going outside what's in the center.
What do you feel you deserve? You have to know what I lost to even ask that question. Casualties cannot be measured, right? Like, you can rebuild the city, but you rebuilding the human spirit, I think we deserve the same thing the Japanese got. We deserve the same thing that Rosewood got. We deserve the same thing that victims of the Jewish Holocaust got, because everything we lost fits, right? We're talking about mass graves, humiliation, being forced to wear tags as if you're property. Again, you're talking about a people who managed to do everything America has ever told you you need to do, and then strip it from you like it's an experiment. Why is the city trying to throw a centennial and leverage it for money without paying justice to those people who deserve it?
So powerful, Chief. And it's clear that from a project to reach out to students and neighbors to reclaim this story in your own voices, it's project wrong. Can you, by way of wrap up, can you tell us, before we transition to Randy, can you tell us a little bit about that process of growth? What did you do? What were some of the key moments or people that helped that growth, helped that movement coalesce around what you were doing?
Well, on the top of the list are the 3 living survivors. Hands down, the 3 living survivors. And right parallel next to them, I would say the ancestors of Greenwood, those like my grandfather, those like, the descendants who are around me on a daily basis. These people really just put it all out there, because I think about when I went to Congress, those 3 adults, I saw 3 children sitting before Congress, because that's who were testifying. Children were testifying about an experience that they had along with hundreds of others. And it's the first time in history that they were able to be heard. The momentum that created for us is magical, right? It's miraculous, it's powerful, it's legendary, to say the least, because I felt myself saying, there's no way I can ever give up. And I have a woman who's 107 years old testifying before Congress, and she's sharp. She's just like, wow, like, what am I looking at? Who am I looking at? Just to be in the presence of people that powerful is amazing. And it really expanded our work.
First one, the weirdest beauty tip I've ever heard of is
one of the things that's so powerful in your
snails on your face.
Sorry.
To our colleague Randy Hopkins' work, because one of the things he expressed is a fear that this fear on the survivor's part, that they're being buried alive, that their story and that indeed their experience is being buried alive. And this whole their metaphor of covering up, of burial, I think is a great segue to some of the research that Randy has done, and sort of looking at different kinds of sources to figure out how did this 100 years of cover-up unfold. And so I'll turn now, perhaps, thank you so much, Chief. I'll turn now to Randy to sort of tell a little bit of his story. How did you come to be attached to this work of uncovering this attempt to bury experience and to bury this atrocity?
Well, it's sort of the history department at Portland State's fault. I had always had as one of my major hobbies studying history, just to try to understand it for myself. But I took a number of courses, audited a number of courses from Professor Ken Ruoff in East Asia history, and he somehow inspired me to start writing. And after I dabbled around on East Asia history a while, I decided I'd better go to some place where I knew the lingo, and that was my old home stomping grounds in Tulsa. And here I am.
Wow, that's excellent. So here we are, indeed. I remember getting that first email from my colleague Ken saying, you might want to look up this fellow named Randy Hopkins, and I'm so glad I did. So can you walk us to the benefit of our audience? I've cheated. I wrote your wonderful work, but for the benefit of our audience, can you walk us through some of your findings, some of your insights, and some of the historical mechanisms of silencing that you in your own way have begun to unravel and uncover?
Sure. Well, I've adopted a term for this 100 years of silence. It's called the Great Forgetting, and which created a knowledge void in the world, really, about what is now called the Tulsa Race Massacre. And so in an effort to sort of bring that history alive, I'd like to talk to you about two of those events that I've come across. And just like people can have descendants, so events can have descendants. And this first event began on Wednesday afternoon, early evening on June 1, 1921, on the top floor of the Tulsa City Hall, which is where the Tulsa Chamber of Commerce had its office. The chamber was a collection of elite and would-be elite Tulsa white businessmen. And Tulsa was a very proudful place back then. It had come essentially from a bend in the river 15 years earlier to this glittering, ultra-wealthy metropolis. But on the afternoon of June the 1st, that glittering image had been called into question by the fact that 40 square blocks in an area called Greenwood had been leveled in a matter of hours by an organized blitzkrieg military-style offensive. And soon the pictures of the damage were going to hit the nation's newspapers. And what would people think about Tulsa then? So the Tulsa Chamber of Commerce that evening came up with a rather brilliant public relations scheme. It was formulated in time to hit the morning newspapers in Tulsa that were announcing a morning conference of 40 to 50 of the big movers and shakers, the white movers and shakers in Tulsa, who were going to put a plan together for rebuilding Greenwood. Simultaneously with that, and you might put up insert one there. This is a headline from a local, the Sapulpa Herald, and I include this here because Albert J. Niles was the head of the Tulsa Chamber of Commerce, and he printed an article. It was claimed that the city was mightily, its pride had been hurt by this event, and that they were going to rebuild Greenwood. They actually used the phrase reparations. It's the first incident I found where the word reparations was used, and it came from the head of the Chamber of Commerce. And you can see from this headline, it was written for the United Press, which meant it went to the newspapers all across the country. What this meant was that on the first day of national news coverage of the race massacre, you had a lot of pictures of the damage, the dramatic event. But the second day of national news coverage would put all of that in context. We've got a series of the national newspaper headlines here that we will take you through to show you how that context was explained to people all over the United States. The Daily Oklahoma, the largest newspaper in the state of Oklahoma. The Muskogee Daily Phoenix. Tulsa wishes to atone for the tragedy. The Wichita Eagle, to rebuild the raised Negro district. These go on and on. These are just a few samples. I think we have, who do we have next? This is the New York Herald. No, this is the Austin American in Texas. Also to rebuild. This is the New York Herald. This is the Pittsburgh Daily Post. Notice they actually use the word reparations commission. Victims to get damages. This is the context that people are introduced to Tulsa, and it's one of honor and integrity, heroism. This is from the front page of the New York Times. Tulsa in remorse to rebuild homes. Bid now put at 30. Shame over the riots. Going to rebuild. The article itself, which is on the front page above the fold of the New York Times on June the 3rd, said that 1,000 white businessmen had already signed up for a large fund to rebuild Greenwood. Once that heroism headline had taken effect, it was reported that people all over the country were going to make contributions to the rebuilding fund, at which point the second part of the plan came into fruition. You see this from a St. Louis Post headline, where the same committee of the Chamber of Commerce that put together the reparations plan were now telling people across the country, do not contribute. This is Tulsa's problem. We'll handle it on our own. Don't start campaigns for raising money, and don't send money.
I have to blow my nose. Hold on a second.
From an outside source.
Okay, thanks.
Together the fake reparations plan. We're telling everybody to move on. Nothing to see here. As for the reparations plan itself, it died out almost immediately. This is the June 4th front page of the Tulsa Daily World. It is the largest circulation newspaper in Tulsa. It was intimately tied to the very richest and most powerful businessmen in Tulsa. That little black space you see down there was a small headline captioned Tulsa. The reason I've included the entire page from June the 4th is that is the only day in which that ad appeared anywhere in the Tulsa world. One tiny ad, one day. It was just a public relations scheme, and it worked. And that was the end of the first attempt to give reparations.
Is anyone listening with me? I'm having trouble with my blood pressure and my allergies, so I need to blow my nose again. Sorry.
Reported on and started the anti-lynching campaign a generation before this event. There was a snipped, it was microfilm, but you could see it had been snipped out where the article should have been. So it's bringing me, a lot of emotion here, and a pattern, right? That's what historians look for. We look for patterns. So, bringing this forward, just the way that she kind of brought forward the story of recovering, authentically recovering the story of Greenwood for the community, for the survivors, for the next generation. Bring us forward, Randy. Bring us forward in the story of silencing and the treatment of victims. I know we're going to slightly switch focus from the committing of atrocities to the treatment of the victims and their remains, but catch us up in the way that you tell us about your new explorations.
Okay, well, if the refusal to collect funds was like the second part of the Great Forgetting, the first part of the Great Forgetting was getting rid of the bodies. And there's plenty of evidence that bodies were stacked like cordwood. That was a repeated phrase that they somehow got rid of. And so the pursuit of the mass graves, alleged mass graves, has been one of continuing interest through the years. Exactly 100 years after the Chamber of Commerce got together for their reparations scheme, on June 1, 2021, an earth mover began removing topsoil from a portion of Oakland Cemetery, which was owned by the city of Tulsa. You saw a chief standing where the excavation was. And it was set for the exact 100th anniversary of the burning of Greenwood. And I hope we have a chance later to hear from Chief and get his reaction to the fact that they picked that exact anniversary. But they did it for maximum public relations impact, because for several months before that, the celebrities had been arriving, documentaries had been shown, there was media coverage, and the focus of the attention was back on Tulsa and Greenwood in a way that it hadn't been for 100 years. And that's when they began unearthing what they quickly determined was, in fact, a mass grave. So it was another heroic effort, apparently. And it was a heroic effort that lasted for about 3 weeks, during which time bodies were unearthed, remains were transported to the lab for study, and it appeared that things were being done finally the right way. On June 24th, however, there were two announcements. One, that the dig is over after a mere 3 weeks, and two, that they had finally discovered evidence of gunshot trauma in one of the victims. It sounds amazing when I describe it that somehow finding one gunshot trauma victim would be enough to shut down the entire investigation. That's the script that the city of Tulsa has given us for this particular event. As part of the mass graves investigation, the city appointed with the dig were being sent home. They were there from the University of Oklahoma.
Allergies, sorry.
Sent home. There were 8 professional archaeologists provided by a private corporation called Cardno, who were supposed to be there for 6 to 8 weeks, and they were sent home after 3 weeks. There have been no public meetings. There have been no public meetings of the Oversight Committee since the 100th anniversary. Finally, in response to Chief's emails demanding information, a private briefing where the public was excluded was set for late July. The purpose of which really was to get the Oversight Committee to rubber stamp a decision to rebury the unearthed remains, 19 of them, back in the same hole where it had been unearthed, along with at least 14 or possibly 15 remains that were never unearthed and would not be unearthed. And when information as to who made the dig, they got no answer. One of the things the mayor had promised when they started the mass graves investigation was to conduct it like a homicide investigation. That didn't happen. There was a big problem with reburying the 19 remains back in the same hole, because as it turned out that hole was located with a creek running through it. So every time it rained, it filled up like a swimming pool or a mud bath. And so to put them back in the same place was itself very questionable. At the end of the meeting, the Public Oversight Committee voted unanimously to delay the reburial. It hadn't even been determined whether these remains were race massacre victims or not. They're still being studied. The head of the research team on the ground from the University of Florida voted to join the Public Oversight Committee to oppose the reburial. The state archaeologist from the University of Oklahoma suggested that it would be a good idea perhaps to rebury them if you're going to do it in a place that was not susceptible to flooding. And yet all that was brushed aside. And on July 30, there was just a stunning theater that was unfolding. What you see from this picture is the outside of the fence where descendants of the race massacre and other interested people were gathered protesting this arbitrary reburial of the remains that they now firmly believe are race massacre victims. On the other side of this locked gate, where the reburial was taking place, let's start showing that. This is part of the reburial. They've now housed some of the coffins in tight coffins. There were a number of infants that were found in this mass grave. And on the next photo, I think that these are the infants that they are reburying. And I think I mentioned that there are at least 14 or 15 remains that were never removed from the pit. These were some of the 19 that were. Somehow there was a ceremony arranged inside Oakland, and here you see part of it, largely white. It's unclear who picked them, why they were there, and this is moments before the reburial. And after they said their few words of prayer, while the descendants are for the most part locked outside, then the machines go into action.
Why wouldn't they let them in?
Why all this happened on July 30th is unclear. Those machines that you see there are owned by the city of Tulsa. The guy in the vest works for the city's water and sewer department. They could have done this reburying anytime they wanted, but they decided to do it on July the 30th. And it didn't matter what anybody else said. Just keep scrolling through these photos. Among the questions that remain, why was it so important, even before determining whether it's a race massacre victims, let's hold it on this one for a while, that they had to rebury them? And one possibility is that just like the people back in 1921, some of the people in charge in 2021 wanted to send a message that nothing has changed.
Powerful stuff. Maybe a little segue here that maybe will lead into your final thoughts before we get to the clip is to just tell the audience, maybe in your own words, Randy, about this sort of this other storytelling project about the mass graves that the documentary that you're working on. Catch us up with that a little bit, and then we'll hear a little clip.
Oh, sure. We had the bright idea of course, I've written an article about these events, and it's at the Center for Public Secrets.org called Echo of History. But we also had the bright idea to do a video documentary, and I was in Tulsa a few months ago, and we got a number of incredible interviews from Chief and other members of the Public Oversight Committee, which are being edited down into what I think will be a powerful documentary. And I know you're going to show a small clip from Christy Williams interview here shortly. I can tell you that this isn't going to be forgotten about.
Let's tune in to the clip now, and then we'll turn it back to Chief for some final remarks and the Q&A.
You know, when I was carrying the children, I thought about my kids who are adults now, but I thought about I'm a mother, and it just hurt my soul. And then to know that these babies were reburied back, I felt like I was rescuing them, and then they were taken from me, from being rescued. And I feel like I let them down, even though it's nothing that I could have done further than what I've done. But to keep hammering this thing, and to let them know we are not done, we're still going to keep fighting. But that it's traumatic. It was traumatic to bring these bodies out of the ground, and it's even more traumatic to have them, and I say snatched from us and put back into the ground. I'm trying to find the right words to describe it, and I don't think there is a word to describe that feeling. But feeling that, I go back and just, you think about life as a Black person in America, period. And I think about my ancestors and those who fought for justice and never got it. And here we are, 2021. And I have these bodies in my hands, and they're gone like that.
Can I add one thing that I left out? It's a very important one. When they removed the remains, the 19 remains, they had members of the Public Oversight Committee. Chief was one of them. Christy was another. Carrying these remains to the lab for study. And the city made very careful efforts. They have a drone overhead to record it all. And again, it's part of this heroism thing that lasted for a while. And once the bodies had been carried to the lab, in effect, the Public Oversight Committee had served its function and were cast aside.
Well, the flat dirt is sort of the covering up again of the space. It's another act of violence. It's really dramatic. I feel like you need a breath to recover from this very powerful.
Yeah, we're going to need some flow therapy.
Oh my goodness. Well, it's fun to see the chat lighting up with swords, memories of Tulsa, and for folks in our audience. But officially, while Andrea and Christina Rojas and your gender, Christina Rojas collect up the official questions that people are putting in the question and answer, maybe we could just turn it back to Chief to have some final reflections on all that you've learned, all that you've done. You have an eager audience of students and fellow citizens here in Oregon, and just love to hear just your thoughts about what's next for you, what you're currently working on.
Deep breath. Oh man. Well, let me first thank you. I didn't get to do that. Thank you for making this possible. Thank the university for having the just being willing. I really appreciate it. We appreciate that. What's next is, it's weird because it's like it's always so alive and so current. You don't even feel a next happening. It's like it's endless, to the point that you're like even now, I have the mass graves on my mind. I have the current nuisance lawsuit where we just went to court with the 3 survivors and some of the descendants a couple of weeks ago. There's a lot to carry here. Like Christy said, including remains. And we appealed to the DOJ also to take over the investigation. So those are the things that are next. You know, it's just a great deal of work, you know, and trying to, I don't know, I guess bring some justice, healing, and sensibility to this, you know, so we can figure out how we even move into the next. Randy has done an outstanding job. I mean, this Randy Hopkins' work. I haven't seen any. You know, this has been a long journey. You know, and I haven't seen this type of commitment, involvement, detail. And I'm not saying this for the sake of flattery. I'm just saying as a matter of fact. This work and this partnership that we have is what the world has been waiting for. You know, like if we can establish these types of connections, right, with people, we can actually make moves to transcend the illusion of reconciliation, right? And so I think that's what we're doing. These things have to become tangible, otherwise it's just a good idea. And so that's what I would say, you know, that's where we are right now.
I just appreciate your perspective so much. It's that embodied truth.
Yeah.
That opens that transformation and tears down illusion and makes us all human again, humanizes us and allows for, you know, genuine connection and genuine shifts, change. It's really powerful. We've got a few questions in the chat and in the Q&A that I would love to share out. One of them would love to hear from each of you about connections to some of the complexity in Oklahoma and Tulsa, including Native American history. And Chief's remarks, he mentioned how there were mixed heritage people who were victims in the Tulsa Race Massacre, and how that connection continued over time and was able to be a point of entry for people into this story, right? So we have a question that says, could the presenters reflect on parallel events that occurred in the same time period as the Tulsa Race Massacre in Osage Territory, recently documented in the riveting book Killers of the Flower Moon? It seems notable that the same kind of mindset was in play in an effort to exterminate and appropriate the wealth from the Osage Indians at the time.
Randy, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I'm not much of an expert on the Osage situation, and so I don't like to just talk on about things that I'm not fully up to speed on. There was, the Native American situation is just so intertwined here. Christy Williams is a descendant of a Cretan freedman. Much of the land in North Tulsa had been allocated when the federal government was trying to eliminate the tribes. They took Indian land in Oklahoma and they gave them to individual members of the tribe on a limited basis, and then there was all the extra land, which there was plenty, got sold off. But in the case of Greenwood, one of the allocated owners of land just to the due west of Greenwood was Rachel Brady, Tate Brady's wife. And if you go about a mile to the east of Greenwood, it's called Cherokee Heights, which came to be controlled by Tate Brady's political ally, Buck Lewis. And anybody who has studied Tulsa history knows, especially the history related to the Race Massacre, what important role that Brady and Lewis came to play in all of that. So it's all intertwined and around. It's one reason Oklahoma history is just so amazing, because it's like the ultimate melting pot. It's what did they carve on the side Statue of Liberty? Send us your wretched refuse, and we're all descendants of the wretched refuse that came to Oklahoma, and I'm proud of it. So I don't use that in a derogatory term, but it makes for great history.
Yeah, I'd like to. I can speak from a different viewpoint about it. What's unique about the Osage is that they were not part of the Indian Removal Act, right? They were not part of the 5 slaveholding tribes. So they had a different relationship with the people in that area, particularly with Black people. And I've read some stories in the Tulsa Star about a particular Osage woman named Eva B. She was extremely wealthy, and she spent an enormous amount of time in Greenwood, and she contributed money to organizations, and
Hello.
so we know that those relationships existed, although the relationships with the tribes that created freedmen, they had a very tense relationship, a very different relationship. And so Oklahoma is very unique in that way. We talk about Juneteenth and it being a public national federal holiday now. The only problem with that for Oklahomans is it excludes freedmen. Because freedmen were not freed during Juneteenth. They were freed literally 2 years after Juneteenth. Juneteenth is celebrated because of 1865, the general going down to Galveston and explaining to the people who were enslaved there that they were free. Well, it was a year later that 1866 that the 5 slaveholding tribes had their treaties enacted. It was 1867 when they were actually, sent on their way and got land allotments. If they were lucky enough, the Chickasaw and the Choctaw weren't so friendly in that area. So, there are some parallels. There's some. You start to see, like this connection, the Osage, these Africans, these newly freed Africans, and that this new attitude. You got wealthy Black people in a community, and you got wealthy Osage people, and so you start to see some. Similarity I saw was I've read some a number of theses about the Indian Removal Act and the 5 slaveholding tribes long before they were removed. There was this fear that runaway slaves and other members of the African, formerly enslaved African, they would form alliances, and there was a great fear about that. So it's like we civilize these tribes, we don't have to worry about it. And so you start to put these pieces together. And so that's what I like to do as a history recovery specialist, is try to piece certain pieces together to figure out how do we fill in the gaps. Because if it doesn't make sense, it just doesn't make sense. Yeah.
So powerful. It's so rich and so much work left to be done, which there's a lot going on in the Q&A and chat about what can we do, what can we do. We'll hold that maybe to a few more minutes. I have a couple more questions maybe to share out. Audience member says, speaking of descendants and the complexity of the current population in Tulsa, like everywhere else, it's complicated. Are there any descendants of the white individuals, business owners, and descendants who carried out the massacre that are alive today, including the police chief and other government officers and officials? To what degree have they been outed and held accountable?
Well, let's start at the end. Zero accountability. Zero accountability. There hasn't even been. There's been admission that it was a terrible event, but there hasn't been any accountability. No. People use the word reconcile, but we haven't reconciled to reconcile. And so, that's sort of that is problematic all by itself. Yes, there are people who live today. We at the Center for Public Secrets, we actually interviewed a guy who called us and said, "Hey, I'd like to. Maybe we need to." We were talking about having a descendants of both sides have a red table discussion. We talk about what would happen if we got together and we actually got to speak to each other as descendants. Then we might actually be able to see through a common lens, and you'd actually be able to realize, look, you're a victim just like me, right? Because you have to preserve something that is actually painful. you're being forced to preserve a painful history that makes you enslaved, historically enslaved. I have to be enslaved because there's no. I mean, I'm oppressed because there's no justice, there's no remedy, there's no restitution, there's nothing, right? No healing. There's just a continuum of the same repetitive thing. Like we're both volunteering for insanity, and we don't have to. you know, but overall, to get people who are, and that's one of the things we mentioned in the Mass Graves Oversight Committee, one of the Mass Grave Oversight Committee meetings. I told the mayor, I said, Mayor, you know, it's funny that every time we have this meeting, the city is always saying we need more people to come and tell their story, not more people to come and just be willing to be accountable, right? And my attitude is, we can go to every university in the United States, pull up every archive, every photo that has been collected. We can go to the Smithsonian, pull up every photo that's been collected, and just pass them around throughout Tulsa, because it's a legacy city. It's not like this is just a city of newcomers. You have people know who these people are, these photos, right? Like 100 years is not that long ago. We still have 3 living survivors. So we know that there are people who are living who know who these people are that are in these photos. It's just a matter of admission and accountability, and it just hasn't happened. I've had people call me and say, hey, I'd like to privately have a discussion with you to talk about what my family told me and what they know. But that's as far as it will get.
Hello.
It's not like people are saying, well, our role in that was X, Y, and Z. They're just saying, this is what we know. This is what we saw. This is where we were told mass graves were, where they put bodies. You know, that type of commentary. You get that. So it's sort of like let me find a place to put this. You know. So that's as far as we got. Yeah.
Amazing. A few more questions in the Q&A with your permission. Maybe we'll let Chief rest for a moment. Maybe Randy can field. A couple of questions are coming up: the reburial ceremony and how from your perspective that kind of went down. A couple of questions. One, did the individuals participating in the reburial have any connection to the victims? If not, why weren't descendants allowed to participate and instead were locked out by the barriers? I mean, it's sort of without question. But I wonder if you have any insights to share about, you know, the why and wherefores of how that happened.
Well, the Public Oversight Committee was invited, and given the way they had been given short shrift, most of them opted not to participate.
Okay.
There were at least 2 members that were inside. Okay, so and I would suspect that the rest of the ceremony was sort of accidental. I had the forklift operators there with their jackets on, and so they participated as well. Who put it together? You know, there was apparently a white preacher there saying a prayer, and how he was invited is unknown. The meeting of July 27th ended with the Oversight Committee saying, let's not do it on the 30th. The city had promised a bunch of answers before then, didn't get it. Instead, they just said, we're going to do it anyway. It was one of those things that parallel to many events of history where there's no, it's just the authorities want their way and they're going to have it.
Yeah, that seems like a lot. So go ahead.
Yeah, it was a pre-planned event. I mean, at the end of the day, that's really what it was. We had a meeting the Tuesday before the reburial. We voted unanimously not to rebury, not to do a ceremony. There was no opposition. We were told in this direction with it. But apparently, during that time and before, it took a lot of care and time to put those remains back in those white boxes and put those white boxes in the ground. And I'm almost certain they were already there when we were having that discussion, right? But nobody wanted to admit, we jumped the gun. We have made a drastic mistake, right? So you already have opposition. So of course nobody's going to be a part of that ceremony. not amongst those of us who are willing to be vocal and express opposition to an unfinished job. You know, and we didn't want to participate in the fact that the city itself is now actively participating in creating a mass grave. Because if you have remains that are still in there untouched, then you are a willing participant in the reburial, in the burial, the creation of a mass grave. And that in itself is criminal. In the meantime, I was speaking with Demario Solomon, who has the Justice for Greenwood Project, and who's also the attorney for the nuisance claim for the survivors. And he was in D.C. And I said, listen, we got to stop this. Let's do whatever we need to do. So we filed a restraining order to try to get this thing stopped. So on the morning of the reburial, the only problem we had is that they said, well, it has to reach a judge's desk, literally reach a judge's desk before they start covering the remains, because once they start covering the remains, it's too late. So that was the predicament we ran into, and you had people who were descendants, who have family members who went missing, do not know where their family, what happened to their family members, and they were at the fence, just in so much pain and anguish over the fact that we're not even allowed to come into this space to honor our own, to potentially honor our own, right? Because it's not like somebody. I think there's a perception that this was some upright mission, right? Like these people went and they buried these remains in there, and they took good records, and we've identified their race, their gender, their names, and we got it all transcribed, and you can find that at the local library. No, so there's no way we're going to know if one of our descendants are in that cemetery, because there were mass graves all over the city. The city itself is literally a crime scene. The whole city, because you're talking about a community that had a population from 15 to 10,000. If the Red Cross says we had 6,000 people that we can account for, that leaves you, let's play with the low number of 10,000, that leaves you with 4,000 remains that you cannot account for. Let's say they were able to leave like my ancestors were. Okay, let's just say 1,000 were able to actually escape from a city that had been surrounded and the telegraph lines cut, and nobody's coming to help you. What happened to those 3,000 people? Let's just play with it and say another 1,000 were able to hide out somewhere. That still leaves you 2,000 people.
Is this working?
Not account for.
I don't see the mic going up and down.
Document where people interviewed white who told them there are mass graves here, there are mass graves there, they're all over the city, and even out on the outskirts of what was then the city of Tulsa. There's so much documentation. It's just that the torch was passed to each generation, and nobody dealt with it.
Such a powerful formulation of the city as a crime scene, and it's really kind of breathtaking. And I think it actually gets back to a question raised earlier about the complexity of Oklahoma history and Tulsa history. And we also have very good documentation, as well as an old tradition within indigenous communities, that one of the fulcrum points of oppression takes place at moments of death, or as per saying, just taking care of children. So these very tender human moments is when power, like you can see the teeth chomp, and because it disrupts generations, it creates a vacuum where power can then fill in and or cover up the act that has been perpetrated, and so that's a kind of you shared a very powerful formulation that actually builds a bridge to how the United States was settled and colonized and constructed in the interests of economic elites and white folks. So it's a brilliant link, and it's really going to stick with me. We're coming around to about 5:20 p.m. There's a theme in the Q&A. A lot of students, I think, are saying, what can we do? How can we support, as Chief Amasan said, your duty to your ancestors to bring awareness? As students, what can we do or not do to keep this conversation going, to keep honoring those whose lives were robbed?
Yeah.
And continue to be robbed.
next, I'll speak to some tangibility, if I may. The most, justiceforgreenwood.org. You can find that on the internet, Facebook, Instagram, justiceforgreenwood.org. Center for Public Secrets. These are places that you can contribute to, whether it's time, resources, money. These are things that are actually happening right now in real time. These are events that could change the how history is going to be told. How we're going to tell. What are we going to tell our children in the future? Right? What are we going to say about ourselves right now? What's powerful, I think. I'm trying to articulate this because I know time is an issue. Marjorie Taylor Greene. Remember, this woman had so much to say about the Jewish Holocaust. She really tried to marginalize it. Just really spoke at a high level of ignorance about something she knew nothing about. That's what we've experienced in Tulsa, Oklahoma, because this is a 100-year cover-up, historically or otherwise, where people, the whole story was hidden. Well, what happens to people what happened to Marjorie Taylor Greene when she went to the Holocaust Museum, right, and got a real checkup, a real psychological checkup to figure out, okay, these events actually happened. This is a real thing I'm talking about. And I just made a really stupid comparison to something that is horrendous historically. It forced her to reckon with her own inhumanity. That's what happens when we tell the truth. When we tell the story in a way that is unapologetic. Like when you read Randy's writings, that is the most well-written, unapologetic. He has done a brilliant work. That's all I can say. And I believe me, this is not a matter of bias. When you read it for yourself, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Especially if you already read anything about the Tulsa Massacre, you'll be able to say, "Oh, wow, this is really deep." Because now I see.
Sorry about the.
Now I understand why I'm not connected to it, or why I'm able to. I'm not feeling that. I feel sorry for this situation. Crimes like this happen all across the globe. Oh, buddy, not like this. Wait till you read this work, right? Wait till you see the research that's been done. It forces you to rethink what you think you know, right? It forces you to actually think. Let's put it that way. And so that's what it's going to take. It's going to take of yourself by really educating yourself, especially when you have all of these resources and all of this documentation that's accessible to you. My God, if I had access, like many of you have access, it would be a miraculous thing, because then I wouldn't have to argue with people about. I wouldn't have to sit in a courtroom where you have 3 living survivors tell their story and have an attorney tell the survivors, and me as a descendant to myself that the problems of the ancestors cannot be the problems of its descendants. You wouldn't have to hear an attorney tell 106-year-old Mother Randall she didn't lose her home. Her parents lost their home. This is the kind of stuff, like, how do you tell a 106-year-old woman who's there to speak for herself and testify to her own story, and you marginalize the most marginalized people on the planet, which happen to be women and children, but you continue this process of oppression openly, unapologetic. Like, how do we deal with that?
It's just this denial that we're all connected, and we're all connected to our own ancestors and our neighbors and everyone in the community. It's a torch. It's called psychological. There's something there that has to come unclenched.
Absolutely.
Final thought. Thank you for that. Final thoughts, Randy, for the students in the audience. What can I do going forward? How can I help?
Use your own creativity. Study if there's something, it's not just this issue, but if there's something you feel strongly about, do something about it. Use your creative instincts. Use your time and energy. My way of thinking about reparations is, if the government gets around to it, that's great. But to some extent, we don't need the government. If enough people gave of their time and their energy and their creativity to projects, that in itself is a form of reparations. Maybe not the final reparations, but it's better than sitting back and waiting on someone else to do it.
Yeah, me and Randy had a discussion about this real quick in our first panel discussion together, and that question was asked, and I said, if you had a Christian, a Jew, and a Muslim sitting in front of you, and all three were starving, and you had three options. You had a chicken meal, you had a pork chop sandwich, and a hot link. And you gave the hot link to the Muslim, you gave the pork chop sandwich to the Jew, and you gave the Christian the chicken sandwich. Tell me what's wrong with that picture. You gave them what you wanted them to have, but you didn't ask them what they need.
We just did it.
Yeah.
We just did it.
Beautifully put. My students are working on some things very similar that are happening in Portland, Oregon. You don't have to look too far. You know, this is clearly Tulsa West, but there's also Portland, Oregon, and we have many projects, many ways that, as you're saying, we can commit to one another. We can commit to that repair part of reparations and make a shift and make a change. As one of my history students said, yes, last month in class, our history is now. It is not the past. It is now. It's with us. And I want to thank Randy Hopkins and Chief Wally Hassan for sharing your now with us, for sharing your history and your now with us in such eloquent and compelling terms. I want to thank the audience members for your time, attention, and questions today. I want to thank Andrea Janda and Christina Rojas for their technical support and know-how. All of our co-sponsors, Black Studies, Center for Public Secrets, History Department, Portland State. This is the first chapter, I hope, friends, of a year-long collaboration. I want to welcome, I think I said this at the top of the hour, Randy and Chief are affiliated research scholars with the History Department this year. We want that relationship to grow and keep this for the students who want to know what to do. We're going to keep at it. We're going to have more programming, more connections, maybe a film series in the winter, hopefully a keynote speaker in the spring, and just build this relationship out and keep this work going. So thank you all. This concludes the formal part of our presentation. All these wonderful thank yous are coming into the chat. It's been a great afternoon. Thank you so much. And beautiful. We'll save all this. And all the attendees will get links to things that were referred to by our discussants today, as well as the site where we're gathering all the resources, the videos, the clips, the evidence, the photographs, the articles, so we can continue to study tomorrow. Thank you, everyone. It's been a great afternoon. Stay well, stay healthy, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Recording stopped.
Great, nice. Thank you for coming on the chat.
Okay, bye, everyone. Thanks for listening with me. And Woof Woof and Bear. And Bo and Sweet Potato.
Andrea had some technical difficulties. That's why you see two of her.
Thank you.
I clicked that.
Okay. Oh, these are such nice things. Thank you for an incredible panel. Wonderful presentation. To continue to work on behalf of this issue and the people involved. Thank you for speaking to us. It's moving and informative. It's beautiful. Excellent. So blessings in our lives. Very shameful event. Not surprising in our culture. We'll keep it all. We'll preserve it.